Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this first public online talk from the Contemporary Art Society for Wales in 2023. I'm Roland Davis, Vice Chair of CASW, and I have the pleasure of introducing this evening's speaker, Joanna Whittle. Hi, Jo.
Hello, nice to see you.
Now, Joanna is a member of the Contemporary British Painting Society and has had numerous solo exhibitions, whilst taking part in group exhibitions and projects, including with the Heavy Water Collective, of which she was a founding member. In 2019, she was winner of the Contemporary British Painting Prize and was a selector for the prize in 2021. She was awarded the New Light Valeria Sykes Award in 2020 and has work in their permanent collection. In 2022, with Heavy Water, she undertook a funded research residency with Cardiff University Special Collections, G39 Cardiff, and Kunsthaus Dortmund. Her most recent exhibitions include On Shifting Ground, a solo exhibition at the Whitaker Museum in 2022, and The Tyranny of Ambition, an international exhibition of British and Irish painters at Highlines Gallery Ireland. She is currently engaged in a research project with the National Fairground and Circus Archive, which will culminate in a solo exhibition in 2023, supported by Arts Council England. Now, Jo's agreed to take questions at the end of this talk for those of you who are joining us on Zoom. We would like you to put your name and question into the chat box, and when we get to the point for questions, I will explain how this will work. So, Jo, it's entirely over to you.
Okay, hello. Thanks for the introduction. That saves me having to do it. I'll just say before I start, I've put my link tree in the chat, and that's the place to find kind of references where I refer to different things. You'll find all the information in there, so that's a good link to copy. So I will start sharing my screen and hope that it works. Okay. Can we all see that? Is that okay, Roland? Is it there?
It's there.
Okay. So here we go. Get the start slideshow starting. Okay, so why On Shifting Ground? It's the name of the show I recently had at the Whitaker, but also as I kind of walk through this kind of trajectory of my painting practice, it kind of shows how much I kind of think of shifting landscapes and moving landscapes and changing landscapes. I started with this slide because it's kind of a peak painting from the Tents series, you know, which is what I'm quite well known for, is my circus tents and fairground paintings. So this was in 2019, after winning the Contemporary British Painting Prize. So I'll start here with, I'm going to also start my timer so I don't go on too long. So this is really an insight into how I make the work. I go out and collect source material, and then use it for my means. And it's this idea of creating an arena of painting in which the creator chooses the elements, and that you set up this idea of truth and then this idea of space that the painter can inhabit, the painting itself can inhabit, and the viewer can also inhabit. So you'll notice in all of my work, they're never peopled, and that the point is that the only presence really is the viewer, apart from the suggestion of a once past presence or a recent presence or something hiding. But I remove people so it enables the viewer to inhabit the space. On the right, there's an image of an exquisite corpse, André Breton. And the reason I put that in there is because I tend to think of my paintings almost like collage or still life, because they kind of become ossified and static because I'm taking different elements, and it allows for this stillness in the work that you don't really get when you're working on a scenic landscape. So I'm not really creating a scene, and I'm not talking about experience. I'm talking about this kind of space in which the viewer can enter, and it's always still, and the viewer brings themselves to it, really. In recent reflection, I've thought that I can't really talk about my practice without talking about my childhood. But this was the start of my landscape painting and the landscape I was referring to when I first began the journey, but realize now that it's an ever present kind of understanding of landscape that appears in all of my work. So I grew up in this very isolated little community in the middle of the desert in Saudi Arabia. And it's not a romantic desert. It's full of wrecks and ruins and old bits of machinery and rubbish tips and angry camels. But it's this idea of isolation, this idea of creating worlds. You create your own world, and that moves in a pace through my work, but also the topography of the desert, living in the desert and being in the desert. And it's a landscape which kind of forces you to inhabit it, and doesn't give you that scenic remove and this kind of permanent visibility you have where you can be seen and you can see everything with this kind of never-ending horizon. So I'll start really with my painting practice. And this was when I did my BA at Central St. Martin's. It was in the 90s. I graduated in 97. And this wasn't really a peak time for landscape painting. And I was really interested in abstraction and interested in working with paint in this way. But I was also interested in translating this experience of landscape and really for landscape read space, you know, inhabiting space and how one inhabits space and how paint expresses paint, but also the materiality of paint. So you're working with surface and you're constantly working with materiality and illusion. And I was really fascinated in a way that you can deal with surface, you know, scratching the surface, marking the surface, and yet the paint itself will pull you back into illusion and create this space. I was thinking about Pollock a lot at this time. And again, just those ideas of inhabiting and him physically inhabiting the arena of painting. I was working on a large scale, kind of thinking of these ideas, the larger the painting, the more space it gives you to inhabit. And that's quite an interesting start from me doing tiny miniature paintings. But forever in all of my work, there's this tension between surface and illusion and space. And I was also thinking a lot of phenomenological space, Merleau-Ponty, and I was thinking of experiential space and space that kind of inhabits you and you inhabit, this duality. And also I was reading a lot of Gaston Bachelard and the kind of poetics of space. So space was what I was focusing on. And I think it's a really good basis for where the work takes off to, because I was looking at materiality, laying and defining this arena of space. So when I was at the Royal College, where I did my MA, we went on a nice trip to New York, which was wonderful. And I was there. I was really excited about seeing the Pollock retrospective. But then I did pop into the Frick collection and I saw this painting, this Bellini painting. And again, it wasn't at the height of a time when people were really looking at landscape so much. So it was in a dark little corner. And I put this other image on the right because it was restored in 2011 and there was a lot of hubbub because a beautiful painting, beautifully restored, and it kind of had this kind of pride of place. But when I saw it, it was a very intimate moment. It was in a dark space, and it was this kind of illumination of paint. And it was kind of a signifier to me that really I needed to work in landscape in a different way, but I didn't want to work in a landscape way like this. I didn't want to make this painting because this painting had already been made, and I wanted to find a place to inhabit somewhere between that kind of Pollock space, that inhabited space, and the landscape, the defined landscape. And this is where I started thinking about this forensic detail. It was this forensic detail I loved, the kind of detail of each leaf and these rocks that are almost fluid, and each pebble. And the funny thing with Bellini, you know, I always think of him as a landscape painter, and he was sort of forced to put figures in, and it feels like fuzzy felt donkeys stuck on, and they kind of feel awkward in the space, which I liked. So when I won the Contemporary British Painting Prize, I was very fortunate to have Griselda Pollock write an essay for me. And when I was talking to Griselda, we spoke a lot about the desert, and it reminded me that presence is still there in all of the work I make. And I'm really interested in her saying, you know, the desert is the defeat of landscape. And it is because of the lack of stability, the lack of those structures that that give you that scenic landscape. But there's another interesting space which opens up, and my paintings are full of these verticals which define you and place you and give you structure, and nevertheless the ground always shifts. And this, I'm very interested in this idea of these deities in the desert. You know, at the time, my mum's an Irish Catholic, so I was being half brought up in the Catholic faith, not very well. It didn't take. But we were looking at these children's Bibles and all these kind of lurid descriptions and depictions of all these kind of things that happen in the desert, and the temptation in the desert, and the devil, and you know, this wild transgressive space as a backdrop of Christian culture, which again, you know, thinking about space and landscape as this site for cultural activity. So this is another very large painting. This was after I graduated. So these are about 5 foot by 6 foot. And also this is when the ruin came into my work. And really brownfield sites I was looking at, because they were the only spaces that I could really identify had the same feeling as a desert landscape for me. You know, very similar pitch, similar tones in color. And then I was just continuing to make landscape work. While I was at St. Martin's making my white abstract paintings, I was also sneaking into the National Gallery regularly, looking at paintings like Friedrich. I went to Tunisia around about this time, in 2000s, and I saw this tree in the mountains of Tunisia. But also being in Tunisia was this kind of flourishing of desert again, the smells, the sensations, plants that I'd forgotten, and it's really kind of impactful, romantic moment, but romantic in a sense of sorrow, really, and feeling exiled. But I really like this very simple mirroring of a Friedrich painting, you know, with a pylon representing Christianity. And again, I was looking at these, this is another painting. This was another site I worked on, Fulbourn Psychiatric Hospital. Again, it was a funny terrain where they had all these buildings that were gradually being taken apart, where this hospital is this ideal of a hospital and therapeutic support was kind of falling apart, and they were gradually taking it apart. But also thinking about how heavily surrealism plays in my work, and really in this idea of static, this stillness, and that's, you know, created with Ernst. And obviously this huge structure reminds me of Ernst's Celebs, but also the textures in surrealism that flip between, you know, mimicking the texture they are and then becoming a forest and becoming an illusion in paint. And I think that's what I'm always working with paint, is this materiality and this beautiful kind of magical flicker it does with all of these elements coming together to create this kind of oscillating sensation of illusion and materiality. And I think also these kind of still spaces allow for this arena. And I think, you know, there's 3 people present in the paintings. There's me, the painter, there's the viewer who's enabled to inhabit this space by its emptiness, but also the painting's presence. And there's a moment when you're painting where you define the painting, and then this tension flips and the painting starts to define itself, and it becomes another space and another presence. And that's always quite a magical, unsettling moment when you're working. So after a while, I'd been making work for a long time, and I started to feel like I was making the same painting again. I was showing with Agnews, I was selling a lot of work, and I felt sort of confined into this oeuvre of painting. You know, as I go through this slide talk, I think actually, in a way, we all do make the same painting again, but translate it and it changes and morphs. But at the time, I kind of had a break from painting. I needed to leave London. I needed to earn money. Did various different roles working with landscape and environment and the other interests that I have. But this role, this was in 2010-11. I hadn't been painting for 4 or 5 years by then. And I was working at this scheduled ancient monument, Landguard Fort, which is in Felixstowe, on this tiny little peninsula that you can see on the right, which is a triple SI of coastal vegetated shingle. And then next to the largest container port in Europe, or it was at the time, I think it keeps changing. And it was just such a fascinating space. I was running an arts program, running lots of things, but I wasn't making work. But I was thinking constantly about landscape and constantly about these different islands and how they communicate with each other. You know, the gun emplacements had become a bird observatory. You'd see all the birds leave in September and then come back in the spring. That was their last point before they went off on their migration. So this kind of landscape was absorbing into me. And again, this kind of strange site, which again was much like the desert. And here's just some images of it. You know, there's a gun emplacement on the left, that's Darwell's battery, and then these coastal artillery searchlights, which would have, you know, put searchlights out to sea, and constant looming cranes. And then when snow comes, you know, snow appears a lot in my paintings, this nature, this tension, this covering and silencing. I used to walk about on the top of the fort, which I probably wouldn't be allowed to do now, health and safety, but I used to watch everything and all of these things happening. On the top right there, there's a crane they pulled down because it was too small, because the container ships were getting larger. So they tied wires around it and pulled it over with just some vans and pickups, and I watched it crumble in a very kind of anthropomorphic, emotional and tragic way. So I was being kind of subjected to this kind of drama within this strange landscape. Equally, there was Sealand, that was on the coast of Felixstowe, which was an independent principality. It was an old sea fort that Prince Michael of Sealand took over and claimed an independent state. Britain then extended their waters beyond 12 miles to encapsulate it. Then Sealand extended their waters. So to this day, it remains an independent state. So this was kind of, all of these interesting things were kind of firing in my brain. And I started to make work again, but only in this very piecemeal, these little kind of assemblages of little bits of drawing, little bits of photographs. And really, it's the first time I started to create worlds, and the first time that I started not to be present as the author of these worlds, thinking about what information can come together to create a world. So all of these little images in the corner were ostensibly not by me, but by people I'd invented. They were a kind of accumulation of a history. So I wrote diaries, letters, maps, created characters, you know, these little portraits from the back of shipping magazines, and these little stamps from Sealand, which I titled Independovia. That was one of the parts of the world I created, which was called Dovia, which is really just an anagram of avoid, simple as that. And this is one I made later on. This is one that I still work on, but that I will work on till I die, accumulating these tiny little bits of ephemera. And also when I fell in love with the miniature, because this painting is 5 times 3 centimeters. And it was the first time I understood landscape in the miniature and being able to use gestural painterly marks within a tiny, tiny arena, and what that says and how that lures the viewer and brings them in. And I kind of abandoned at this stage this idea of vast space being a space for the viewer to inhabit, and that they can inhabit space through the intricate, through the intimate, and through the tiny, which pulls you across a room rather than tells you what it is from a distance. So I just put this in because I find it quite funny. I was still making paintings, but you know, this is up to 42 centimeters, I think, so larger. And I was starting to think of detail again and really kind of working into detail. This was 2015. And also this is where the paintings were starting to unravel from reality. My dad was starting to suffer from dementia at this stage. So I was really thinking of reality, what defines reality, what defines memory, thinking of hallucination as well, and scale, taking elements from different landscapes and creating these funny, intimate little spaces. But when I look back at this painting alongside the Bellini, it feels like I've remade that painting without knowledge of that. And this is my kind of return to painting. And this painting appears again in the palette, in the diagonals, in the erect figure, everything. It's a recreation of that painting without my knowledge. So I keep this painting. I'm going to sell it. After my dad passed away, that's when the tents emerged. And I think there is something there in in this kind of idea of tent and concealing and covering something, and something gone and hidden, something that's past. And I was during the time of my dad's illness, I was working at festivals, and it was a nice thing to be away, but also, you know, you got to be there free and you got food. But the best thing about it was that you had access to these spaces while they were constructing them and while they were completely empty and unpeopled. And it would be in darkness and dusk at dawn. And you suddenly saw these things emerging, this made up world that was only going to exist for 4 days, 5 days, and then it was going to be dismantled. And also, they were kind of perfect in the way that I make paintings, because I construct them. I kind of think of my paintings more like a construction, like an engineer. So I'll take parts that I'll, you know, does that tree stand up? You know, creating a tent and adding in the guy ropes, you know, line by line, and that holding it up and bringing it to life. But also it was a way to create color, because if you look back at that Bellini palette, you know, that was this kind of landscape, rock, earth palette, and being able to have color and that startle of color in the landscape, which you see when you see a tent from a distance. You suddenly see something out of place, and something that has presence, but through fragility, which I find fascinating. And at the same time, there was more of these elements like mud and rain and this kind of shifting earth and the impossibility of structures standing. You know, everything was becoming unhinged and untethered and motile. And the paint reflects that as well, kind of motility of paint, which you see again in this one. This one was in the Contemporary British Painting Prize. And there's light is the other kind of thing in my work. It's a large element in this kind of uncertain grey light or darkness, or this glowing light, this last flush of the day where everything kind of becomes magical. And that's my real love of landscape and landscape painting. So even though I speak about these ossified static spaces, there's a kind of romance and love of it as well. And also with a lot of the light in my painting, that begins in the very first stage. So I'll paint the base of the painting in these very kind of neon colors and work onto that. And then this light shows through at the end, either because it's left or because of rubbing back to it. And again, just to mention the Contemporary British Painting Prize, but actually being part of the Contemporary British Painting Society is really wonderful in being able to constantly talk about painting and think about painting. And it feels kind of important that you're involved in this discourse. And this is another painting that was in the prize when I was also thinking about rituals in the landscape, thinking about people moving through landscape and doing unseen activities. But these kind of morning activities, you know, this residue of emotional behavior, emotional memorial. I live near Hillsborough Football Ground, and there's lots of shrines. This is one that was near an old car show warehouse, which I kind of covered over. And this is a solitary shrine for a family member. But I became really interested in these kind of perennial idea of it that kind of, you know, mimics the landscape in the way that, you know, someone will be remembered and then a year passes while they all die off, and then they flourish again with remembrance on anniversaries. So again, I was thinking about my family history again after my dad's passing. This all kind of happened in a kind of fulcrum. And my dad was from Stoke-on-Trent, and we have kind of ceramic history in our life, you know, always talking about ceramics. My nan always buying ceramics. And I wanted to not paint. My whole purpose of painting is to keep narrative from it, to leave it as this space to be inhabited by me, by the painting, by the viewer. So I was looking for somewhere else to kind of find narrative and to allow for narrative. And I sort of looking at these kind of transferware plates, and the idea of them, they're so beautiful and appealing and detailed, and yet they're kind of ephemera, you know, and this transfer print, and hundreds of them are made. And I was kind of turning this process upside down really, and making these ugly things, and then making these beautiful drawings that were unique. You know, they weren't transfer prints, they were slow. And I was thinking about these mezzotints that were in the Millennium Gallery, these Turner mezzotints, and the intensity and beauty of them. I kept the Alamy stock symbol on it because I liked the way it kind of dances over it, and this kind of layer of beautiful fine art and the way it kind of embeds in culture and becomes sort of tarnished by it, really. So that's what I was looking at, and I called this pastiware, you know, just because of the making of it, but also thinking of them as souvenirs from these different worlds I was creating, ephemeral souvenirs that yet took a long time to make. So it was at this time I won the Harley Open Prize. It was a busy year in 2019. And they invited me to work with the Portland collection. So the Welbeck estate is in Nottinghamshire. It's a dukery, and the Cavendish family inhabited it for many generations. And they collected things throughout their time there, and they still have descendants live there today. So the estate is largely inaccessible, but they have a collection called the Portland Collection, where they have all these artifacts. And I was working with them. They have a huge collection of miniatures as well, but also the kind of eccentricities of the landscape, the hiddenness, these strange, you know, so much topiary, and it's kind of a wild world, really, in terms of for a painter to explore. The seventh Duke built these underground tunnels so that he could go from the abbey and appear at the edge of the estate and get to different places. A lot of them are inaccessible. The one on the top left is a Pulhamite tunnel, which is an early form of cement, which is kind of like a surrealist material because they press shells into it, and so it's embedded with all these kind of shells and marks and faces. But actually, I got DYCP funding for this from the Arts Council to develop ceramic skills and working with collections and thinking about curating collections and authenticity of artifacts and describing of artifacts. And then lockdown hit straight away. So I was working with this site from a distance, really, and that made it more kind of magical and strange. And it really kind of took off into this whole new creation and this whole set of artifacts and paintings from this invented world, which was an extension of Dovia, really. It just got a different symbol in the middle. So this is just a reference to really how I make artifacts. This was Mary de Medici. She was the Queen Consort of France, and she had a sad ending because she meddled too much and died in penury. But really, I was looking at this little rosette on her neck, and it's in every portrait of her. And I was thinking of this kind of this holding of things, this holding of mourning. And there was a beautiful display in the Portland collection as well of the last items that King Charles had with him before he was executed: little gold toothpick, a pearl earring, and this idea of holding something and concealing it. So this is how the artifacts evolve. And I think working with collections, archives, it's an idea of avoiding the illustrative, and, you know, and still working with something to create something new that doesn't just illustrate what's there. I was working with fabrics in the Portland collection as well, a lot of Van Dyck paintings. There was a historical fabric expert, Hannah Marples, who sort of gave me a tour and learning about all these politics of fabrics and meanings of shot silk and linen and lacework and slash sleeves and all of these things that they reveal and tell you about things, people, history, you know, this kind of cultural history of fabric, and working these into paintings. So it's just a really interesting time, to explore my practice, and to stay with that tension of painting and not telling, but offering a space to inhabit. Still in lockdown, this was when I made this little copper painting. This was the one that won the New Light Art Prize. And it's a tiny little postcard sized thing on copper. And it toured the country with the exhibition. A lot of it was in lockdown, but, you know, seeing it in this tiny little spiky, prickly thing, very painterly, but also, again, looking at this idea of unseen activity and this illumination from within and the illumination from the copper below, always thinking about light, always thinking about a presence that's been and may return. So another kind of aspect of the landscape which exists in the work, forests. Again, I found a load of negatives of my dad's, which I was scanning in over lockdown and discovering all these different landscapes. my mum and dad had lived in Germany before I was born. So there was this kind of mythology of the forest in our family. And yet I'd never really been in a forest, apart from once in Ireland where I got lost, and that was terrifying. But it's this space, this kind of space of transgression, this space where kind of mythologies emerge and anything can happen to you and anything can change. There's a kind of hidden terrain. So coming out of the second lockdown, and we were just allowed to back in our studio because I work in a group studio, and it was freezing cold and dark, and I was thinking about these forest spaces. I was thinking about what we'd all been through and thinking about mourning and all these. There was this sort of fulcrum of all these ideas that just started with a little brief painting on a postcard. And again, thinking about these unseen activities, but the change in structure to a portrait form meant that these shrines face you. They become almost more like portraiture. And there's always an illumination, but there's always an absurdity to the electric lights in my painting, in that they can't possibly be lit because there's no source of electricity, but it's these creepy flourishing and also an absurdity with them because they're tiny. And when you look at the paintings, they're just a tiny little fleck of paint. And a lot of the lights that I use in my painting are actually from miniature techniques. So a miniature pearl earring and how they work to create that luminosity. I'm thinking about working with postcards, because I buy boxes of vintage postcards, and these are the old format, so they're 9 times 14 centimeters, which makes them smaller and kind of more delicate. And they're also paper and they're aged, so they're not like a rigid hard postcard. And then I prime them and layer them and prepare them, and then they're painted on. And I think they're kind of very beautiful things to hold because they gain a weight from having been painted on. They get heavier and heavier, and I love that. The more you work with them, the heavier they get. They also smell really strongly of paint. They kind of hold that smell of oil paint even when they're long dry. So I really love the kind of visceral presence of paint on postcards. And then I kind of work on a copper size, postcard size as well. And that's this idea of copper, that they're kind of like icons, and this idea of concealing something and taking it with you. I like the idea that my paintings can be concealed, but that presents a bit of a problem in display. So also in 2019 to 21, I was on the Freelands Foundation residency, supported by Freelands Foundation in London, but ran from Site Gallery for our cohort. And this is where I was working with Victoria Lucas and Maud Hayabavaira. This is when we formed Heavy Water, really, because this was our installation. But we were working on this. This was work we were producing on the residency. But again, we couldn't communicate with each other. We were all in a studio, but weren't allowed to see each other. So we'd have Zoom meetings, and we were talking about this installation with Angelica Soule, who is the curator at Site Gallery. So she drew this plan that again we saw as a diagram on a Zoom call. And when we went to install the show, we still weren't allowed to be together to install it. We had to do it on different days. But it was this kind of distance of not being able to actually be in the space where it unfurled in the imagination and became this kind of really interesting space that accommodated all of our practices into this one world. And I think the strength of it was the darkness. Maud and Vic both work with digital media, and we wanted that to have each thing to have its right. And also because I was working with shrines and these wayside shrines, thinking of these big looming kind of German shrines, these big Catholic things, and thinking of showing the paintings in them. And it enabled me to show the paintings strongly lit with this light on them. But also the exhibition was sequenced. So none of the videos were on at the same time. You kind of moved around the space, and it really became this kind of other dimension. So I was showing my artifacts, and Kerry Campbell, who was also curating, came up with this cabinet and this kind of illuminated little window into the relics of dough, which again evolved from Dovia. So all of this has evolved from those very, very early days, 10 years prior, when I was working at Landguard Fort, and these artifacts started to emerge in this world, these objects that you hold, but also the ability to show the paintings within the shrine and this luminosity, and it to be illuminated from a distance, and you move closer and closer to get to this tiny little painting at the end, and the ritual associated with adorning the shrine, which took a very long time, piece by piece, petal by petal. So you mentioned the Heavy Water Collective and our recent residency in the introduction. So this was a really kind of magical residency at G39 and the Cardiff Special Collections, in terms of having time. This was a Four Nations funded project, and having time to spend in an archive and having time to make work. In the link I put on in the chat, you can go to there. We did a talk on our research findings from this project, so I won't talk too much about it because you'll be able to access that there. But really, I was looking at, the Reformation and these texts from the Reformation, and this idea of a bifurcation between two faiths, and political and ideological, and kind of mirroring that with images from the First World War and this kind of rupture, this other split between landscape and humanity and land, and these kind of violent turmoil, really. And I was also using the time to draw. I often don't get time to draw. I'm either finishing paintings or working on projects, and drawing feels like this kind of luxury, and I was constructing these drawings from sources and layering sources, and these sort of palimpsests of different layers, different times, different periods, so 19th century scrapbooks, war poems, and kind of more contemporary sources. And again, I was really thinking about kind of motives, and again, the way working with source material and how you work with that without being illustrative. And for me, and this pace that's moved through my work has to create new realities, and how to authenticate these new realities. And I think through repetition of motifs. So, I was looking for images in the archive, in these photographs from the war, and finding figures, and recreating them into a new mythology, and through repetition, and through the kind of structures of ephemera, making them into a reality. So I was taking this nurse figure, and putting her onto other artifacts. That's also based on a medieval communion vessel, which is on there, and making paintings. So again, is this kind of multi-layered repetition of practice, and this kind of mythology, and this forests were weaving into it. There's lots of images of forests, of kind of battles taking place in forests, like glimpsed soldiers, and snow returned again, this sort of muffling of snow, and this idea of snow and paint, this real materiality between snow and paint, and how white paint is really similar to snow. It's kind of onomatopoeic, or they're so analogous with each other. So when you're kind of blanketing this beautiful sheet of copper with white paint, it's a similar experience to this blanketing of snow. So then we had the residency, brief residency at the cemetery, Sheffield General Cemetery, and I was working on other projects at the time. But I will say, before I forget, that this will be some of the artifacts that we created as a collective will be shown at the Graves Gallery in Sheffield, opening from the 15th of March, and we'll be doing a talk on the 19th of April. That will be in real life, so you have to be in Sheffield. But yeah, that will be curated, and that's because Vic from the collective is curating a whole selection from their permanent collection. So that's that. So while all this was going on, I was concurrently working on a research project as part of Festival of the Mind, which is a festival they have in Sheffield where they fund academics and artists to work together. So I was working with Lizzie Craig Atkins, and I was also working with Dr. Jane Wildgoose, who runs the Wildgoose Memorial Library in London, and I was looking at material culture, and I was thinking about all these material culture and archaeological landscapes, and this layering again of landscape and this layering of presence, you know, from the surface and down, and layering through the soil, but layering through kind of cultural material. And again, these kind of bifurcations that happen beneath the soil, and how you're chosen to be buried and what you're buried with. This was a piece of work I made from that. This is a piece from Jane Wildgoose's library, and that's a picture frame which I then translated into one of my shrines. But it was taking into these ideas of Victorian mourning, and these strange nighttime funerals they used to have, and that's on this cusp of when the body stopped inhabiting, the dead body stopped inhabiting the present, and memorials started to occur. So these are some of the artifacts I made, and keeping an eye on the time. So as part of the visit, part of the project, Jane and I went down to visit the Rothwell Charnel Chapel, which Lizzie had worked on. And it's one of the only remaining kind of medieval ossuaries in Britain. And these are kind of collections of bones, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of human bones. And it was quite a startling experience to be below a church with these. But it was, again, what I was saying before, in that the dead inhabit the earth. So they still existed. The dead still had a presence within the contemporary at that time. I felt very uncomfortable taking photos. So I took a few, and then I wanted to get rid of them because I felt, you know, I was trespassing in this place. So I kind of made this kind of Catholic reburial by putting them on a memory stick and creating a coffin, and these kind of purgatory prayers, because purgatory was a really large aspect of this practice. And here's some of the artifacts I made, just again thinking of these things that are found with people and these mythologies that come out of them, because often nobody really knows what they are. So there's you make assumptions. And that was a coin I got from the Vatican, because one of the people are often found with bent coins, because bending it shows a contract, shows that you've been on pilgrimage. These little pilgrimage shells show you've been on pilgrimage. So I got that I got that on eBay, and then bent it with a friend with a blowtorch and a mallet. And this is just a brief image of the show at the Whitaker. The Whitaker was a really beautiful experience because I was able to kind of have a retrospective, as it were. So I was showing work from 2002, and then this new piece on the right, working with some of the items from their collection, these little Bellarmine jars, which are really beautiful. And some of their kind of mourning ribbons and items. So again, that kind of discourse between archival material and your work and your practice. Again, returning to postcards, because they form such a large part of the work. I make so many postcards, and they take a long time, and they're so ephemeral but so highly detailed and so light to the touch. But I was able to display an entire wall of my postcard collection and some of the paintings, and set up these lovely conversations between them. And the postcard collection is funny because I buy these boxes of postcards, and half of them I have to keep, more than half of them I have to keep, because they're too beautiful to paint on. So they kind of are in dialogue with the paintings I make, whilst not being direct source material. So this is to introduce the project I'm doing with the Arts Council now and the National Fairground Archive. This is just a cyanotype I did of one of my paintings, which is gone because I sold it. So I've worked with fairground equipment for a long time, and that's been moving through my practice, you know, since the tents have as well. And if you look at this wave swinger on the right, it has a really analogous feeling to the shrines, and this kind of inhabitation in them, this kind of other presence, and this fragility, and this movement of them around, and this creation of worlds, and they're kind of illuminated and moving, and they create this wild world that disappears after a few days. And also the world within the world within the world, in these kind of Rococo designs, and a lot of fairground work, which has its own history. And some of the people I'm working with, won't go through them all, but I'm working with a 5th generation showman, Sheldon, we've been talking a lot about landscape. Caitlin, who's a ring mistress, one of the youngest ring mistresses. Vanessa, who set up the archive. Julie, who's a photographer, also an architect from Manchester, who's written books about fairground architecture, and this kind of where something transient and something transient can still be considered architecture, and what that means, and working with different archives. And in the bottom right, you can see a picture of Bob Chase. I think Bob's here. Hello, Bob. Me and Bob went down to King's Lynn, but I'll tell you about that in a minute. But he's someone I've been working with. Quickly introduce Caitlin. So she became a ring mistress when she worked for a circus that got trapped in lockdown, and her mum was taking pictures, and then they trained her to be a ring mistress. So this is me at Gandhi's circus, who she now works with, and sort of being a part of this setup and this other life that happens, around these structures. This is a really important thing that Bob and I did last week. We went down to King's Lynn Mart. King's Lynn Mart is the opening of the fairground season, and it's a historical fair that's been there for 800 years. And it starts the season, and I really wanted to go down. This photograph on the right is Bob's, and I found these in the archive when I was doing my research, and it's a beautiful set of photographs that Bob took in the 70s. I hope I have the right date on that, Bob, but around 78, 70, the 70s of this mart. And they're so compelling and so beautiful, and I'm making some work from them. But it's these figures, and we wanted to know who these figures were. So we got in touch, we decided to go down, and Bob got in touch with the Corn Exchange, and they let us show these photographs for free. So I went down and was kind of moving in between the mart, trying to get showmen to come and see these photos, because we wanted to identify people in the pictures and wanted them to see this historical fair and these kind of generations taking part. So there's a picture of me on the bottom there, with these showmen who eventually came in to kind of persuade them in. It's a very, very busy time for them. And it was a really wonderful moment where they recognized family members, aunties, parents, themselves as children. So this, Bob set up a Google folder so they can now add to this kind of growing archive, which will then be added into the National Fairground Archive. And that's something, when I see something beautiful, when you work on these funded projects and engage with people, and it kind of flourishes and becomes something beautiful. And on the top left, Bob's been taking pictures as well of the showmen that were working there when we went down, and they'll be added to the archive. This is just a really nice, because I met Lawrence and Nipper when I was at King's Lynn, and then we found them in the archive, and there's pictures of them. And it was really wonderful to talk to them, and I interviewed them, and for them to be able to share that history, and know that it was going into the archive and giving names to people, because showmen were recognised on the census for the first time as a distinct cultural group in 2021. So it's really important to document and kind of celebrate this history, actually. And also for me, it was an understanding to go past this kind of romanticism of it and actually understand the kind of reality, and the kind of hard graft that's involved. So ending here, so when I did go to Gandhi's circus, they were using this tent in October, and it's the tent I started with, and it was really funny to see it from a distance, and to be inside it. And I'll just leave that up, because that's a recent painting, and just thinking of that fragility, and the tents are slightly changing because they're becoming more luminous, they're becoming closer, and more concealed. And also, just to finally end, I've managed to do it on time. That the paintings remain this kind of celebration of landscape and being in the landscape, and being surrounded by landscape and light and beauty and nature. And it's a celebration of nature. And I think that's it. I've kept for exactly 46 minutes. So I'll stop sharing. It's funny when you're doing that, it feels like no one's there. And you're just talking to yourself.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that was great, Joe. So now we get to questions. I'd ask you, all of you who want to do this, well, everybody, to move on to speaker view. The Zoom controls now let you unmute yourselves, but well, I'd ask please that you remain muted until I invite you to put your question. And once your question is over, could you return to mute as the next questioner is invited to speak? Right, we've got a number of questions in the chat room. The first one is from Louise Manifold. So Louise, would you like to put your question to Joe?
Hi, Joe. Sorry,
Hi, Louise.
lovely to see you and fantastic to hear about your work. It was really beautiful presentation.
Thank you.
I'm listening in from the west of Ireland, so I really connected with how you talked about the landscape of your childhood. And that connection with landscape and creating imaginary worlds, because I suppose living in probably not as barren a landscape, but a landscape that I think was quite interesting. You said about certain landscapes where no matter everything's exposed in it. So I would have had spent a lot of my childhood in that landscape, similar landscape, except a bit damper and colder. But I just loved how you talked about that desire to create these imaginary worlds. And I wanted to know a little bit more about it, because I feel like it's something, maybe it's this connection or how we live in our childhoods, and particular landscapes or environments invite us to think like that. Because I know that's something that's very interesting or particular to me as well. So I kind of just wanted to pick up on that thread a little bit, because particularly how you talk about how the witnesses and the viewers in your work and those relationships remind me very much of, in some ways, how children play a little bit, but not I'm not meaning that in a juvenile way or anything, but just but yeah, sorry, I'm talking too much.
No, I get you. And I was thinking, but are you on the Burren, Louise? You up on the Burren, or you're up that way? I was thinking of the Burren because I was up. My friend lives up near the Burren, so
I wish the Burren's a lot more beautiful to them where I'm living.
Well, I've sort of spent a lot of time in Ireland, so I think it's all beautiful. But yeah, my family's from Longford, and it's kind of beautiful. But anyway, yeah, I suppose I think of those desert landscapes, and you really did invent an entire world, because you didn't have the normal things that people had. You didn't go to cinemas, you didn't do all these kind of leisure activities. So you created worlds. And I think maybe in the desert as well, you're kind of in it, you're constantly digging in it and digging holes and kind of unearthing things, and you almost become a part of the topography. But also it's an avoidance, so these mythologies come, but there's an avoidance, almost an avoidance of doing it in painting. Because to me, painting, I want it to be just really pure. And that sounds really strange, but I just want it to be this space. And even though all these tents come with their narratives, and they come with these, it's the narratives that the people create who view them. So the other objects and the other artifacts, I have this kind of storytelling mind, and these kind of narratives fling off from everywhere. So it's really nice to have another practice which enables me to kind of let rip, really, and to just invent something, but also have this kind of grain, this kind of residue of fact in them, which gives them an authenticity. And that's what I'm really interested in. So they're kind of half invented and half real. And it's that kind of chimerical thing, I think, again, with surrealism and that exquisite corpse. They have their foot in reality, which gives them this more kind of uncanny, or this, not uncanny, but it's a kind of reality and authenticity, rather than them being purely fantastical, I think.
No, that's fabulous. Thank you.
Thanks, Louise.
Thanks very much. Right, the next question is from Sean. So Sean, would you like to put your question?
Yes, Joe, I just adored those paintings. But when you are working in collaboration with other artists, how do you maintain your identity as this incredibly fine artist and painter?
Well, it's I suppose, you know, working with different materials and working with different objects. So I'm very kind of selfish with my paintings, I suppose, and I keep them as my little prize. And I didn't used to, you know, for my own nefarious means, and I didn't used to really bring the paintings into any of these other discourses. And I think using the ephemera and the postcards, I've allowed the paintings to kind of start to inhabit this world. But I think working with other artists, it's almost like you get kind of who you are and who your identity is gets strengthened by this engagement with other artists, by kind of bouncing off them, and you have this discourse, and it strengthens what you know are the kind of confines of your practice, and how they kind of engage and have dialogue with other things and archives, other people, other projects, and yet kind of strengthened by that, and strengthened by their kind of retaining what their essence is, so that they don't become diluted. So I think that's the thing. It's the conversation, I think, the discussion, you know, and it's like working with Bob and, you know, the showman, and, you know, that's like a whole other world. It's a completely different practice than painting, you know, and doing interviews and, you know, editing interviews, which is laborious. But it's almost like, you know, the paintings are so empty, and they're these spaces, these separate spaces that people can inhabit, but almost working with that flip side of the people that actually do inhabit these spaces and kind of breathing that life. It kind of enables the kind of silence and piece of the work on its own, if that makes sense.
That's very illuminating. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Okay, so we now have a question from Gabrielle. Now, Gabrielle has explained that she's doing childcare, so it's not practical for her to actually come on screen and ask the question. So I'll put it for her on the basis then that those who are watching on YouTube will know what the question is as well. So she starts by saying that she absolutely loves your work, Jo, and practice, and finds it very inspiring. And her question is, as someone who has not done an MA, only a BA as a mature student in fine art, what would you recommend as being a way to bring research into my practice in a meaningful way? How best to find one's way into this way of working?
Well, I think, you know, the work I've been doing with archives, and there's this little distance that people have with them, that they feel like it's an academic thing, and they become kind of inaccessible. You know, I didn't work with the Fairground Archive until they invited me to, and, you know, people said, oh, you should get up there, but I felt that I wasn't doing something important enough, that I wasn't doing a research project. But actually archives are there really for everyone to enjoy, and they're really trying to engage with people and to encourage people to engage with them. And the idea that you can just go to an archive, and you can go to an archive if you just want to look at something, and you just feel like, you know, you can select a few items and look at it. And that's where the thread starts. When you start to look at something, it starts to unravel, and you follow this thread to making new work. I'd suggest the best way, most archives, you know, you go on, you can go through their catalogue and see what they have available, but many archives have digitized a lot of their material as well. So you can start to look at what they've digitized, and especially with the Fairground Archive, it's amazing, because if you search the National Fairground and Circus Archive, you can go into their collections, which will give you finding aids, but also they have a section called NFCA Digital, where they've digitized many of their photographs, which is where I saw Bob's. So you can see a lot of their images. So, you know, if it's hard to get to an archive, most archives have digital content online in some form. So I'd start with that, and then once you start reading and getting involved, it pulls you on threads that you don't know you're going to go on. And actually the difficulty with archives for me is I find everything interesting, and it's very difficult to decide where to focus. So yeah, I would start by looking at digital content and going from there.
Okay, I hope, Gabrielle, that was helpful to you. I don't think I've got any more questions in the chat box, so I'm going to take the privilege of chairing this to ask one myself, which really is, if I heard you correctly, you started your ceramics training only really in lockdown or that period?
No, it was before. So I'd say 2019, when everything was happening. I started, there's a place called the Art House in Sheffield, and they do kind of evening classes. So I started to learn there, and ceramics are really interesting because when you don't know about them, you think it's a fairly straightforward process, but there's so many things that go wrong, explosion and kill, you have to learn so much, and it's naive. I naively assumed as a painter that it would be fairly straightforward, but actually, I've been a painter for 22 years, and it's taken me a long time to refine my practice, and it's the same with ceramicists, and gaining that level of skill and knowledge, so yes, I only came to it then.
So
and
I mean,
still learning.
I'm going to say, but from the works you're showing, you obviously became competent, or better than competent, very quickly.
Yeah, and I think maybe that's because thank you, by the way. I think because actually more so, I quickly realized that I couldn't really define myself as a ceramicist, because, I was kind of dipping in and out of that discourse and still working with these other discourses. So actually, I kind of think of them more as artifacts. So each one's kind of very unique in a way because I make it, and I probably wouldn't make another one, or I might make a few that are similar, and developing different techniques. So ceramic to me is also really fascinating because, I work with stoneware, and it's this idea that you work with clay, you fire it, and this magical kind of alchemical process happens and it turns to stone. So I work a lot with it, thinking of it doesn't turn to stone, it's ceramic, but that it becomes this thing, and I use it to mimic stone, I use it to mimic other materials. So in a sense, I'm not really a ceramicist. I'd love to be, but it's a long time to build those skills, I think. And you kind of do what you can with what you know, and then develop within that gradually.
Well, very interesting. I know that we've had at least one ceramicist watching this, so it'll be interesting to perhaps put you in touch. Right, I'm going to take the last question, which is from John Gamblin. John, would you like to put your question?
I think you're on mute.
Yeah, I think you are, John.
Which is what I usually do.
I'm so sorry. I shall mute myself shortly. Yeah, great talk, Joe. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
I just wonder what your thoughts are when we look back to perhaps some of the earlier artists like Laura Knight and Arthur Mullins, who depicted showmen in a very colourful way. And your own paintings, which are great, are very much more muted. Bob Chase's photographs are absolutely wonderful, but they show people in a much more serious and perhaps, as I say, muted way. So how do you think we've changed over those 100 years in our relationship with showground, fairground people?
Well, I think it's what I really think about, and I think about it with the tents as well, is there's a real romanticization, kind of otherness of that, and you kind of romanticize it, but actually there's a reality, and the generations of showmen and culturally, the strength of skill and knowledge and hard work, and the ups and downs of that, there it is a reality, and it's the reality that any of us face in our own different roles and our own different ways. So I think maybe that kind of romanticism is kind of going and unfurling. And I think, you know, working with the showmen down in King's Lynn and them being under the same pressures of all of us are, and pressures of the economy and less people going to the fair, and pressures with the environment and the price of diesel, and not being able to run the machine. You know, if you don't have enough people at the fair, then you have to balance out the cost of diesel. So it's kind of, I think there's a kind of, and in my paintings, there's always, you know, the romanticism is the landscape really for me, but these kind of lives of, for me, it's not about the color, it's about, you know, it's about living in that space and living in that history and living as human beings. And I've learnt so much more working directly with showmen and actually knowing that myself, you know, I had layers of romanticism with that life as well, and kind of learning more and more about it, knowing that it's an amazing culture that needs to be known more about, celebrated, and also, you know, learnt from, I think, and learnt from the kind of preservation of history through generations, and knowledge, just such precise knowledge, such as, you know, the King's Lynn Mart. You know, someone has put their machine there for hundreds of years, and you think, you know, these big flashy machines, and actually there's really modern ones and they're hydraulic, but also there's really old ones that have passed through generations and generations of family members, and the knowledge of exactly where to put that machine every year, you know, not an inch out of place, and how to put the bulbs on. I was talking to someone about the bulbs, and before, you know, when at the time when Bob was taking his photos, they'd have to take every single bulb out because when they were traveling, all the filaments would break. So they'd have to get a tea chest and layers of newspaper and put each bulb in. And then the next fair, they'd have to put every single bulb in again. And of course, they don't have to do that. I'm talking to showmen, you know, and I was asking the same questions, you know, what's changed? What's difference between these photos and now? And, you know, and the really sad thing is, in a way, like lots of us, you know, they said, oh, it's much easier, you know, we don't have to take the bulbs out, you know, and it's easier. We don't have so much physical labor, but there's a sadness and a loss of freedom. You know, there's a lot more health and safety, which they do really well. The health and safety is so vigorous, but, you know, emails and admin and the stuff that all of us, you know, suffer, you know, and those kind of stresses. They said a lot, said they were just stressed in the way that we all are, you know, in different roles. So yeah, I suppose with me, it's that kind of an unfurling of that romanticism, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Yes, and it was interesting to see a guy, I've forgotten his name, he put his name up there, who's looking at mental health within
Sheldon.
the area. Oh, that's right, Sheraton. And yeah, that's a tough area. Things have moved on in many different facets. So it's an interesting, a completely interesting genre, if you like. Yeah,
Yeah, Sheldon set that charity up. He set up the charity during lockdown because obviously everyone's livelihood had stopped and the way of life. They couldn't move, they couldn't do everything, you know, go to fairs, earn money, and kind of suicide rates really increased. So it was like, well, we need to do something for mostly among young showmen. So it's a brilliant charity. He's doing lots of hard work, probably too much hard work. He's very tired.
Yeah, I'll look at that. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, John. And thank you to everybody who put questions. But of course, most of all, thanks to Joe for what a great talk. I have to say, I have the advantage of having heard and seen Joe speak a little earlier in the month in a part of the Heavy Water Collective talk, and I knew in advance it was going to be great, and she certainly hasn't disappointed. Okay, so now in a moment I'm going to ask you all to say thank you to Joe, but before I do, if anyone who's been participating would like to know more about CASW, including how to become a member, we're always recruiting, please visit our website at casw.org.uk for all the relevant information. Also, let me tell you that our next online talk is going to be 1 month today on the 28th of March, when the speakers are from the Gentle Radical Collective. Jo grinning there. She probably knows the torment that I'm going to go through with them before we get to it. So I think we're all going to look forward to that. Watch out on Eventbrite and through the usual lines of communication for members and non-members, which will be coming out shortly. So to bring matters to a conclusion, can I suggest that we all switch to gallery view, unmute, and say thank you to Jo in a traditional manner. Well done, Jo. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Jo. See you soon.
Thanks for coming, everyone, and thanks for having me as well.
Great. Okay, everybody. Thank you all very much indeed.